Alright guys, welcome to another video from XF Motorsports. For this one, it's back to the Skyline GTR because some of the parts for the engine are here already. So we're going to start off by measuring all the clearances inside the engine, making sure everything is set up properly, and then rebuilding this engine. This engine, if you remember from previous videos, it was the engine that we took on a dyno and it didn't do too well. It lost oil pressure and all the bearings, everything inside it just like disintegrated, and now it's time to put everything back together properly. And then well, not in this video, later on we're going to be taking this car to the dyno again and hopefully making proper power with it. So yeah, let's start off by showing you guys how to measure some of this stuff and then get into building this engine. So starting off by quickly going over some of the new parts that we're going to be installing and some of the old parts that we would be reusing. So this is everything from the old engine. The crank that we're definitely not going to be reusing because this crank, after measuring it, it was pretty off. There was journals on it that were off by 0.002 of an inch, and it did have the snout extension on it that a couple of people asked in the comments that these engines had a problem. They had the small snout that used to come in the RB 26 of the R32 models, which sometimes used to slip on the oil pump and then the car lost oil pressure, but this was not the case in this one. The oil pump was fine in this one. The problem was the clearances themselves that were not set properly that caused the whole issue. So we're going to be measuring quite a lot of stuff on this engine, and quite a lot of you people asked to show how to measure clearances and stuff. So I'm going to show a few different methods actually how you can measure clearances on this engine, since we are going to be doing that right now. So this is the block, and let me show you some of the new parts. So thanks to the guy that was rebuilding this engine before, that screwed up on the engine, he did supply a few new parts for this engine. He supplied the crank. This is a new crank, and it's actually the upgraded one, the one from the R33 GTR. So this one comes with a longer snout already that the pump doesn't slip on, and some new parts. This one's the old oil pump. This one was fine, by the way, but we're not reusing it anyways. We're going with an upgraded one, which is going to be coming pretty soon. The old connecting rods, some of them were fine, other ones were burnt, but this is a set of 6 anyway, so we're going to be going with all new ones. This is the rod bearings and the main bearings, and these are the piston rings. So Wiseco pistons with new Wiseco piston rings. The pistons themselves are fine. We already measured those and the scratches are not too bad, so that's fine. But the piston rings, we're going to be going with new ones because those ones are done. And also new downpipes for the turbos. These ones are, I'm not sure what these ones are, but you'll see them later in the video when we assemble the turbos and everything. So yeah, quite a lot of new parts to install. Let's start by measuring all the clearances and showing you guys a few different techniques how to measure all this, and then start off by putting this whole engine together and then putting it in the car. So starting off by showing you guys how to measure some of this stuff and making sure that the engine is fine, because we were starting off by measuring everything on the block, because that's of course the first thing you want to make sure that your block is okay, because if the block needs machining, then that's the first thing you would want to get done, get your block machined before putting anything in it. And the way you can use to measure, like if you're the bore size, and also if your bore has gone oval or if it's perfectly straight. One way is using T-bore gauges. This one is a more difficult way. So you put these T-bore gauges in there and then you tighten them at a certain place, and you make sure that it's tight against the walls there, and basically then you just take it out, you measure the distance with a micrometer, and then that gives you the result. The other way of doing that is with a bore gauge like this one. So you take a bore gauge, you put it in the cylinder itself. This one is, I believe, already zeroed, so yeah, there. And you look for the lowest number. So right now you can see that it stops right at 0, so that's good. And then you take this one out, you put a micrometer on it, and then you compress the micrometer until you see 0 again, and that's actually your bore size then. The other critical thing about your bore is also your piston to wall clearance. So you want to measure like how loose your piston is in the bore. So for doing this, well, one way is that you can actually like put the piston in there, put a feeler gauge between the piston and the wall, and see how much gap there is. Both on the top you'll see a bigger gap because the pistons are actually like they're smaller from the top and larger from the bottom. And yeah, the other way of measuring the piston to wall clearance is that you can also put a micrometer on the piston itself, measure how big the piston is, and of course you know the bore size already, so you can use those two numbers to calculate your piston to wall clearance. But yeah, the piston to wall clearance in this one is good. The pistons are not that worn. There's just a few scratches over here, but this is fine. These are not too bad. Next we got to flip it over and we got to measure the main bearing clearances, so that because that was a bigger issue on this engine. All the main bearings were completely gone, and of course there was a reason why they were gone, because the clearances were not set properly. But of course now with the new crank, All the bearings that we have bought right now are standard size, so that's what we need to measure. We need to make sure that the clearances do come within factory spec with those standard size bearings. Okay, so now we have the engine flipped over, and next we are going to be putting all the main bearings in place and putting this thing over here. You can either put the main bearings in place or you can not put them in place and still put this thing on and measure the gap. If you don't have the main bearings, you can just calculate the thickness of the main bearings and add it to the your calculation. That distance will get smaller by that much. But if you just put the bearings in there, then you can just subtract that number from the size of your main journal on your crankshaft, and then that will tell you the clearance between the bearing and that. I'll go over that in a minute, but for now we are measuring the cranks first, just so that we can know the sizes on the crank. The new crank is going to be really consistent, of course, because it's a new crank. This old crank, though, is a completely different story. So we were just measuring the rod bearings right now and showing you guys the difference we found for the rod bearings. So the new ones, of course, extremely consistent, 22.521. This number is in millimeters, but you have to add 1 inch to it because the micrometer was 0 to 1 inch. But basically, yeah, the numbers are extremely consistent. There's not too much of a difference between any of these numbers. But the old one, when you look at it, it's the sizes of the journals, like 22.255, 22.225. That's a massive difference in sizes. So not only was it not consistently machined, also it was undersized by quite a lot. So after the rod journals were measured, we moved on to measuring the main journals on the crankshaft. So after measuring the main bearing journals, the differences are even larger. So this is the new crank and this is the old crank. It's massive, the differences, and also the consistency. Whoever machined this crank did a horrible job. Like, the smallest journal is 3.898 and the biggest journal is 3.920. So the difference between the smallest one and the biggest one already puts this crank out of range. Like, the difference alone is bigger than what the clearance on the thing should be. So it would have been impossible getting these clearances right with this crank using all the same bearings. The only way someone could have gotten the clearances right is using different bearings, like different thicknesses on different journals to match everything, but that wasn't done in this case. All of the bearings used in this one were the same. So that's definitely, well, yeah, it explains that why the clearances were so off. But next what we need to do is we need to put this thing in the engine block and put all the new bearings in it with it, and then measure the sizes of the bore inside it, and that will give us our clearances, like what our new clearances with this new crankshaft is going to be. Okay, so now we've put the bearings and the bridge on the engine and torqued it down properly. So for measuring the this thing over here, how big it is, we are using this gauge again, the bore gauge. So basically what you have to do is you have to be really careful not to get this in the groove, because if you have it in the groove, it's not going to give you the right number. So you can only measure on this side of the groove and that side of the groove. And yeah, basically all you do is you put this on and you move it around a little, and again you're looking for the lowest number. So we've already zeroed it, so that's why I moved it a little, so now it's off. But yeah, basically it was on 0 over here, and then you move to the next one after that, like that. And this one was also pretty close to the same thing. Really consistent numbers what we're getting on this so far. It's hard to do with one hand though. And after that, of course, you do the same thing. You use a micrometer, measure the distance between this thing, and then you get that number and you subtract it with this one, and we were getting somewhere around 0.25 to 0.3, which is within the range. The range is from 0.2 to 0.4. And we were getting pretty consistent numbers up till this third thing, but after the third one, this gauge is not long enough to go in there anymore, so we're going to use the second method, which is a little more difficult, using these T-bore gauges. So basically, with this one, you have to be really careful that you get the right measurement, but you can get accurate results, exact same results that this gauge will give you actually with this one. But basically, yeah, you have to unscrew this thing so that this opens up, and then you have to put it in really carefully. Get it so that it's extremely tight with the bore, and then you tighten this back thing, and then just make sure to move it around, make sure that it's extremely tight in there, and that will mean that it will give you the right measurement. After that, you take this out, you put it in your micrometer, and then you do the same thing, you measure the size of that. So both ways work, both ways will give you exactly the same results, and the last way we're going to use after doing all that is going to be plastic gauge, which I'm also going to show you later. So yeah, basically 3 different ways of checking. It will make sure that we definitely get the clearances right. So after measuring all the journals, they're all looking pretty consistent. So next what we got to do is we're going to have to take this thing off again, and we're going to put the new crank in. And then the last method of checking is plastic gauge. We're going to put strips of plastic gauge on all the journals, put this back on once more, and then just make sure that we still get the same numbers that we measured. So plastic gauge, I guess the only real difference between plastic gauge and this method of measurement is plastic gauge only tells you the clearance at a point, whereas with these methods you can also turn the gauge around, make sure that you have a perfect circle rather than only measuring the clearance at one point. So but still, it's an extra way of making sure that we are doing the stuff right. So So after using plastic gauge to measure the clearances, I think the numbers are looking pretty good, because this is a gauge. Basically what plastic gauge is it's a thin strip of plastic you put over here and you clamp it with the bearing, and because the bearing clearance is so thin, it crushes the plastic strip and it becomes this fat line over here. And judging by how much the plastic strip gets crushed by, you can look at it on this paper gauge, and that tells you how big your clearance is. So basically, yeah, we are looking for numbers between 0.2 and 0.4. So basically, this one is 0.25 and this one is 0.38. So we know that if the thickness of the strip that's crushed is in between these two, then it would be good. So you can see over here that, yeah, this one is pretty much exactly 0.38, slightly thicker actually, so it's slightly more towards that. Definitely within range. This one is also thicker than that, so within range. Same as this one, within range. Same with this one, within range. This one, yeah, all of them are really consistent. Both methods are giving us pretty similar results. And well, you see the same marks on the top two. So next, all we got to do is we got to take out the crank again, put assembly lube on it, so that the final time we put it together, we're not putting it back together dry. And after that, we're going to get to the pistons and connecting rods, also measuring the clearances for the connecting rods, and then yeah, putting that in. So here's a look at everything after the crank is already put in place, and after putting the crank, just make sure to turn it by hand and make sure that you can turn the crank pretty easily by hand. It shouldn't be binding or anything at any point, so it should be spinning pretty freely, which it is. So the next part is putting the connecting rods in, and but before obviously putting the connecting rods with the pistons and everything, I need to measure the clearances for the connecting rods as well. So for this, I will be following the torque specs that these ones come with. These are not the stock connecting rods, they are spool connecting rods, and I believe these ones are good for 1,000 horsepower. Even the pistons that we're going to be using, they're good for 150 horsepower each. So yeah, all in all, the internals of this engine are good for like 900 horsepower. The clearances on the connecting rods were not as consistent as our main bearing clearances. We did find a difference of about half a thousandth of an inch across different connecting rods, but that was still good enough to give us all the values within the factory specifications, so we still went ahead and used these connecting rods without changing them in any way. After all that was done, it was time to set our piston ring end caps. I opened the piston rings to 0.5 millimeters, which is a little large for these piston rings, but again, because the internals are meant for 900 horsepower, that's the right number that you should be looking for if you're aiming for a horsepower number that high. This engine will not be going up to 900 horsepower right now because the turbos are going to run out of flow. But basically the point is that we're building this engine so that later on, if the owner decides to go with the bigger turbo, he will have access to like the full power without running into any trouble. Okay, so now we've put all the pistons with their new connecting rods, and we've also put the rod bearings in place. So all this is ready to go into the engine. So next what we need to do is we need to like take each of these one by one, use a piston ring compressor, compress them, and then hammer the pistons in, and then bolt the connecting rod end caps from the other side. So these are all the bolts that are going on. This black stuff is the ARP fastener assembly lube. So after a bit of effort, now the short block is all assembled, the pistons, connecting rods, everything is in place, and at this point just one thing to check for is just turn the engine, make sure that it's spinning smooth and there's no restrictions at any point when you're turning the engine. And yeah, all else is looking good. After this point, there's a few different things we can do. Either we can start off by assembling the bottom, putting the oil pan and everything on, or we can start off with the head, putting the head on and everything. But we're going to start off with the head first, putting the head back on. The head is over there right now, and it still needs a little bit of cleaning. And well, one modification that we are going to be making with the head is that there's a plug he wants to open up at the back and add an extra oil drain from the head, because these heads were notorious for not draining oil back to the oil pan properly. Because if you look at the drain holes, well, the size of the drain holes on the engine block that drain oil back to the pan, these are the tiny drain holes over here, these ones, and they're ridiculously small. So of course you can see that it's not gonna send too much, or it's not going to send oil quickly enough back to the oil pan. There's also an oil restrictor already added to the place where the oil feeds to the head. This restrictor is a pretty common mod on these RBs, because if you don't have the restrictor, then yeah, again, it leads to the same problem. There's too much oil in the head. So everything up until this point of the rebuild was going really well, but the only thing I screwed up on was that I did not check the head properly before putting it on, because I was told that this head, everything was done on the head 400 kilometers ago, all new valves, all new seats made for the valves, and valve stem seals, new springs, everything. So I surely thought that everything was going to be fine with the head if all that work was done only like such little time ago. But yeah, that assumption did not serve me too well, as you'll find out a bit later in the video. Okay, so it turns out there is a massive bit of bad news for this engine because I put the timing belt on and I was turning the engine just to make sure that everything comes back to the timing marks and everything, which it did, but the engine, something felt suspicious. The engine was a bit too easy to turn, so I decided to do a leak down test on it, and we did a leak down test, and it turns out the only freaking thing on this engine that I didn't check, the valves, all of them are leaking. All the intake valves, all the exhaust valves, they're all leaking. There's air coming out of the exhaust, there's air coming out of the intake. It's a mess. Yeah, so like that's really bad news right now, because that means that all the turbos, all of this has to come off again, and yeah, the whole head has to come off. The valves literally have to come out. That's the only thing that I didn't take out, because this job was done 400 kilometers before this engine. 400 kilometers, and everything this guy touched, it's just a complete mess. It's like, how much do you suspect is wrong with one engine? Like, all the bearing clearances were wrong, the bore sizes were wrong, it's everything. I had 2 days to finish this engine and get this car out of the shop, but it turns out it's definitely not going to happen now. And the engine was never making compression ever since the guy gave it back to him, because he tells me the same thing, that he did a vacuum leak test on it. The engine was not making proper vacuum right when the guy gave him the car back, and he told him to break in the engine and it was going to be fine. And of course, even after breaking the engine, everything broke after breaking in the engine. That's what happened. It's a mess. It would have been way easier. Honestly, it would have been much easier starting off with another used engine or something, any other engine rather than this one, because literally everything this guy touched, it's a freaking nightmare. It's like, so yeah, you guys are definitely not going to be seeing this engine running in this video, because that's just not going to happen. It's like, it has to come apart. I have to fix this valve issue. We can put it back in and get it running, but it's just going to run the same like it did before. It's not going to be making proper vacuum. There's going to be air leaking out of the whole freaking head, and it's not going to make power on the dyno. It's going to give the same crappy numbers, like 370 wheel horsepower or something, and that's it. It's not going to go past that like this. So yeah, that's really bad news. I guess the only bit of progress we did make for this video was that now at least the bottom end is fixed. But everything else, the only thing that I was suspecting that he did do right, the head, yeah, that also all has to be redone now. So yeah, that's going to be everything for this video. This is unfortunately going to be a two-part video now. And in the next one, you guys are going to find out whatever happens with this engine, whether I decide to throw it in the garbage or whether I actually decide to fix it. So yeah, I don't even know what to say. Yeah, that's it. So ending the video with a slight bit of a positive note, the owner was able to find another used head for this engine. It's a little damaged, it has a lot of knock damage on it, but that's something that I can still work with and fix, because the head that we took off from this engine that guy machined, that is a whole different story. Like, all the valve seats are machined wrong, everything is done wrong, the valve does not even touch the valve seats properly, so it is a lot more work fixing that head. And yeah, it's just, I didn't even feel like touching that head, because yeah, everything that this guy has touched, I hope I never have to see it again, because I've never seen work like this done on literally anything, not even a toy. So yeah, in the next video we're going to be fixing up the used head. It does have a bit of damage on it, all the valves need to come out, be reseated and everything, but that's still something that I'm willing to do to get this engine running. And hopefully, yep, that is going to be the last of the surprises that are going to come from this engine. After that, we are going to be putting it on the dyno again and seeing how much power this car actually makes. So all that is going to be coming for the next video. Thanks for watching. I will see you guys soon.